Hi, how are you guys doing? This is going to be a relatively long video. So grab your cup of tea or coffee and let's get into it. This is going to be a really good video. This is going to be slightly better than the ones I've done in the past because I'm going to take a little bit of time and break things down properly, right? So here we go. The first thing I'm going to show you is a meme that has been put out by a lot of Egyptians on TikTok, on the internet. And this meme, the general idea is to show that black people were not the ancient Egyptians, right? Now, this goes beyond the Cleopatra saga. This goes basically through the whole, this addresses the whole Egyptian culture ever being black, ever. Like, the world acknowledges that at least the 25th dynasty of the Egyptian civilization, right, were black pharaohs, right? But because of the blatant anti blackness that is going around at the moment, even that black dynasty is being denied by Egyptians. And to be fair, not really Egyptians. I think I see a lot of Eurocentrics, Germans, Americans, and the like, with they seized this opportunity to oust all their latent anti-blackness, and the Egypt was Aryan folk have jumped all over this, and they're posting all their memes. And there is one particular meme that seems to be getting a lot of views on the internet, and people really giving accolades to it. I'm going to play you the meme now, and then we're going to talk about it.
I didn't want to do that, but you guys forced me. This is King Tut's sandal, and it's clear what was painted on it, and also this is a wall which clarify what these lions are doing, and all these things are in the museum. You can check it yourself.
Ooh, burn, right? Well, what was that, right? The meme features King Tutankhamun's, young King Tutankhamun's slippers. I'm just going to throw that up nowish. And basically, the slippers show two of King Tut's greatest enemies. Can I just start by saying that this is kind of a self-own with the Eurocentrics and the anti-black Egyptians, because the narrative that you would hear quite frequently is that Sub-Saharan Africans, which I don't believe exists, and I'm going to show you proof of that later on, never were in Egypt. Why? Because there was this giant Sahara between Sub-Saharan Africa and Egypt that black people never made it north. They couldn't cross the Sahara, and black people, or quote unquote Sub-Saharan Africans, only ever made it to North Africa and especially Egypt after the Arabs crossed the desert with their camels to enslave Africans in southern, central, and western Africa. Well, riddle me this. If that was the case, why do we then suddenly have sub-Saharan Africans as enemies of Tut? I'll wait. Total self-own. So we can throw that BS in the bin. I'm going to show you more proof later on why that's complete BS. If we take a look at the slippers, we can see that yes, there appears to be someone who is Nilotic. If you look at their both characteristics and features, they resemble someone who would have been from, or at least resemble the current day Dinka tribe in South Sudan. So these do not resemble the current day Nubians that you find in Upper Egypt, Aswan, or northern Sudan, which kind of begs the question that if these guys were called the Nubians, the guys on the slippers, then who the hell are the people right now in the Nuba Mountains and in Nubia in Upper Egypt? Because these pictures suddenly don't look like them. These look more like the Nilotic people of South Sudan, the Dinka, and even the Nemba people in way down in Angola and as in Botswana, Namibia. So, were these people originally uh, on the border with Egypt and then were driven south by war, enslavement, and raids, the Roman Empire, etc.? That begs the question. Are the current day Nubians, if you look at the current day Nubians, you can see, and the case could be made, and I'm 100% sure that if you were to carry out a DNA survey, it would reveal to be true that they are, in fact, an admixture of the Nilotics in the south of Sudan and further down, as far down as Uganda and Kenya, and of course, the northern light skinned Africans, whether it be Egyptians or Arabs or Mamelukes or the invading forces from Persia, Assyria, Arabia, uh, Mesopotamia, Greece, even Europe, Italy, Spain, right? But that isn't really the topic of today's video. But I think it could be clear, the case could be made from the depictions on the walls uh, that you can go and see to this very day in Egypt, or in manuscripts, in dictionaries, in online, how the Egyptians depicted themselves. Now, there's good news in this also for the Eurocentrics or the North African anti-blacks. And the good news for you is that I do actually believe that there is incontradictable evidence that the early Libyans, or at least the Libyans during the time of the ancient Egyptians, were indeed white. I think they were white skinned, or at least as light as the Asiatics were, as depicted clearly by the Egyptians. They depicted Libyans to their west as white people, or at least really, really light skinned. So, to those people who claim that Libyans were originally black, I would say that doesn't appear to be the case. Perhaps the people that were depicted as Libyans may have come from maybe across the water, or maybe the place immediately called Libya by the Egyptians isn't Libya as we see today. Because if you look at the map, of course, Libya borders Niger, which borders Nigeria. So it's clear that those same borders, which were drawn by Europeans in the last 100 years or so, were not the same as the entity Libya depicted by the ancient Egyptians. But that's perfectly clear that there were light-skinned, nearly white people at least, to the west of Egypt during the time of at least the New Kingdom of the Egyptian civilization. So those guys have been there for a while. So there's some evidence for the Eurocentrics, or the people who are anti-black, or the people who, or evidence against the Afrocentrists anyway. So if we move on to the other thing that people would show on TikTok to get the views and the gotcha and the see your enemies, is King Tutankhamun's walking stick, which depicts a very, very Central African looking figure. Again, this figure is depicted as quote unquote a Nubian, right, in the Egyptian records. But if you take a look at this gentleman on on the end of the stick, he's got features that are very Dinka, or are very Central African, a Congolese, almost what people like to call a Bantu even, right? Now, if you look at his hair, it's tightly curled. And by the way, there are people who still rock this same hairstyle to this very day. If you look at the Nubian, this person is called a Nubian, right? Look at their forehead. You can see very clearly the scarification patterns on his forehead. Something that is very, very African, and something that is practiced again by these tribes till this day. Till this day. So if you go to Aswan in Upper Egypt, or you go to northern Sudan, to the Nubian tribes, or the quote unquote Nubian tribes of today, you do not see these scarifications practiced. You do not see people with this kind of hair. What you see is people that resemble Tuaregs, Bedouins, and indeed mixed African populations. So, African populations that have mixed with the invading and migrating Arab, Armenian, Roman, Mesopotamian, Mameluke, Albanian, Tajikistani, Balkan, European, and Libyan populations, and indeed Egyptian populations that weren't of a darker hue. So that's what you see today. Now, people will tell you in Nubia that they can tell you their great, 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 great grandfathers to the 16th generation. But considering how long ago that we're talking about the Egyptian civilization, that is nothing compared to the time scale we're talking about. We're not talking about 500 years ago. We're talking about 2,000 years ago. We're talking about 4,000 years ago. We're talking about 6,000 years ago. Entire populations are completely replaced in much, much less time than that, right? But let's go to the evidence. Let's just go to the clear depictions that we have. We see that this Nubian has scarifications on his forehead that are still practiced to this very day by tribes like the Dinka in the South Sudan, very deep down in Africa. Okay, and some of these tribes practice the same scarifications across the continent in the Bantu tribes. Now, I don't believe there's any such thing as a Bantu, but it is a linguistic group of different types of people that the Eurocentric people that classified Africans into these bogus, arbitrary groups like to use to refer to people with a certain type of phenotype. Phenotypically, of course, we don't really all look the same, but from the point of view of an outsider, these phenotypes have been grouped into these arbitrarily bogus groups, right? Let's take another look at an ancient depiction of a Nubian. This ancient depiction of a Nubian, I believe that might be have been Greek. It was a Greek depiction of a Nubian. If you take a closer look, you can see the phenotype. That person there could pass as a Senegalese man, as a Gambian, as a Nigerian, as a Congolese, as a Sudanese, or anywhere on the continent. That could be a South African. So that's clearly someone of quote unquote Sub-Saharan African origin. And this person was referred to as a Nubian by the Greeks. And of course, Greeks were perfectly aware of these people. These people were in Greek society, but you would be made to believe that Africans never crossed the Sahara. Right? You would hear them repeated over and over and over again until they start to believe. Now, let's go back to the walking stick. Right? This is the other one that they're not going to show you, and this person depicts yet another enemy of King Tutankhamun, and this is in fact an Asian. So this is an Asiatic enemy of Tutankhamun. You can see from the beard, you can see from the eyes that this is a very Asiatic looking person, and it does say where they're from on the records. Again, Egyptians kept really, really good records. There are no miscommunications or misinterpretations. Well, there are misinterpretations, but there's no miscommunications of exactly who they are depicting, and they use the correct colors. You'd be told that, oh, some of these colors were ever notice when the colors are black, you'd be told, oh, these are just symbolic colors, metaphoric. But when they're white, oh yeah, see, they're white, and that's what you're gonna hear. But I digress. Let's just look at the hardcore evidence. Look at this guy. He is also an enemy. He's treated in exactly the same way as the Nubian. Now, if you know anything about the Egyptian civilization, King Tut was in the New Kingdom, and at this point, they had already been overrun by Nubians, by Assyrians, etc. And these were old kingdoms that were defeated, right? So the Nubians were defeated by the Assyrians, and these two were old enemies, right? So just because you have someone as an enemy and your walking stick does not mean that these people were slaves. They like to show as though these were slaves or servants or some sort of lower class. So if you're willing to say that the black people, the Sudanese, the Nubian, whatever you want to call them, so the Africans, were slaves and servants, then you're going to have to be willing to say that all the Asiatics, the Assyrians, the Mesopotamians, the Persians were also slaves. No, they weren't. They were just enemies, often seen as deadly rivals and equals, right? As this shows. And in case you think these are from different places, here is another one that depicts a Nubian and a Libyan, right? So these are two neighbors of Egypt, Nubia to the south and Libya to the west. So these are two forces. They're proximal to the ancient Egyptian civilization. So it's natural that their enemies will come from people nearby. And that's just what you get when you're an ancient civilization like Egypt. Now let's address Akhenaten. Now Akhenaten is one of those pharaohs that appears to have relatively Eurocentric features, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of posts on TikTok with white people superimposing their faces or Asiatic people superimposing their faces on Akhenaten. And they always pick Akhenaten for obvious reasons because he appears to have really non-African features. They're prolonged, elongated, and appear to have at least either Asiatic or even European features. And, this is a favorite of Europeans. But hey, check this out. This is an indigenous African guy who is clearly either a Nubian or a Nilotic of some kind. I can't quite place his ethnicity, but he is definitely from that sort of Horn of Africa type, I suppose, present day Ethiopia or Eritrea or maybe even Somalia. And this person has the perfect match for, it's that sort of, Kobe Bryant, God bless him, God rest his beautiful soul, or some of the people that you see walking around in the United States that are black people. Again, Africa is phenotypically diverse, and just because someone doesn't have a big sort of wide or flat nose doesn't make them non-African, or doesn't make them not from those areas that you want to think that people come from that have a particular look. Again, it's always exclusionary when describing African achievement, but all inclusive when it comes to discrimination. And that's just how the world works. So you can match white people to Akhenaten, you can match black people to Akhenaten. So there's your evidence. It's clear for everyone to see. So these people making these memes haven't watched my video. It's clear as day that these people are being selective and being specifically anti-black. So enough of the gaslighting, because I brought the receipts today. Now to end this video, I'm going to show you the final receipt that's just hopefully put this bull crap about Sub-Saharan Africa to sleep permanently. Now this is a map of Africa as it is now, and it is superimposed on the area referred to as the Sahara. That's what you can see in the sort of orange little hue there. As you can see, Sub-Saharan Africa is supposed to be, West Africa, Central Africa. The Horn of Africa is Sub-Saharan, and all the way down to South Africa. Sub means under the Sahara. Well, first of all, this is the biggest, the largest the Sahara has ever been, right? So 6,000 years ago, during the time of the early kingdoms of the ancient Egyptian empire, well up into, the era of Cleopatra, the Sahara Desert wouldn't have been this big, right? It would have been, the borders would have come up to maybe the northern Chad, northern Niger, northern Mali, northern Mauritania. In fact, most of Mauritania would have just been in the Sahel and not in the Sahara. Okay, so obviously the Sahara also would have been a little bit lower from the north, so it wouldn't go all the way to the Med like you can see now. It'd be maybe up onto sort of mid Algeria, mid Libya, maybe the entirety of Alexandria would have been quite fertile, perhaps not quite as as Sahara and what have you. And of course, back then, even more of Sudan would have been more fertile and not covered by sand. And as you can see, the Sahara actually reaches into Eritrea right now, when in ancient times, none of that area that is now Eritrea would have been desert at all. The desert would have been all the way up in Egypt and Ethiopia. Look at some of the sub-Saharan countries. Chad is a sub-Saharan country. Right now is about 70% Sahara, whereas back in the day it would have been something like 10% Sahara. Same with Sudan, same with Niger, that is just 100% desert, right? And look at that, Nigeria is half Sahelian and half tropical. And the people in Nigeria, in the north of Nigeria, would have been known at the time as the tribes, the Proto-Hausa, Proto-Fulani type tribes, Kanem Borno, Chadic peoples, right? And if you look to the left, towards Mali, you have where the Songhai Empire, the Great Ghana Empire, Senegambia, and all of those things happened right in those areas. That's where Mansa Musa the Great was from, right? Now, Mansa Musa, in his time, went all the way from Mali across the Sahara. That's basically nearly across all of Africa to Mecca, because he was a Muslim, right? On the epic journey where he takes so much gold and devalues everyone's currency as he went along, right? Now, think of the river Niger, and then think of where Lake Chad is right now. That lake in antiquity was much larger than that. That would have reached all the way into central Chad. Archaeological evidence and geological evidence shows that has shrunk remarkably over the millennia. Another thing that people fail to realize, there's this giant river that flows all the way from Lake Victoria down near Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania type area, across Africa, all the way up, joining with the Blue Nile coming from Eritrea into Sudan, all the way through Sudan and Egypt and into the Mediterranean. So you're telling me that a seafaring ethnic group or group of people like the Horn of Africa, legendary seafaring people in Puntland and in Eritrea and all those places, somehow didn't know how to sail up the Red Sea? I mean, go figure. And as if, given 6,000 years, they couldn't make their way up the Nile? I mean, how dumb is this theory about Africans not being able to cross the Sahara? And just to finish up, we have the refugee crisis that's ongoing right now in Europe, right? How do people get there? On foot. On foot. People have walked across this gigantic lump of sand from Senegal, from Mauritania, from Mali, from Nigeria, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, from Sudan, from Somalia, across the desert. And they found themselves in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Algeria, so that they can access the Mediterranean Sea. So now, if they're doing that now with the level of, lack of information about nature compared to back in the days when people would have been one with nature, would have understood the desert. By the way, there are ethnic groups. The Sahara isn't empty. There are ethnic groups that live in the desert. In Niger, we have Tuaregs, like I said before. We have Fulani. We have Bedouins. We have some Amazigh people that live in the desert. And those people, they know the desert, right? They know the oases. They know the routes. And people cross the Sahara all the time. All the time. This nonsense about the Sahara being this big barrier to movement, absolute bogus nonsense that was fabricated by people that weren't there and people that aimed to separate North Africa from the rest of the African continent. Well, that's today. I'm out, and I hope that this puts things in perspective, and this demonstrates with receipts very, very clearly that people are either ignorant, clueless, or just being anti-black.